7 years and 1 month ago, or 2,589 days to be more specific, I built a closed, tropical terrarium. Traditionally, a terrarium is an enclosed system that facilitates a mini, self-sustaining environment intended to house plants. That's all good and well, but what does it take to maintain something like that? Do they actually work long term? And what is the state of this terrarium today? Questions I can answer better by returning to the very beginning to get a complete perspective. On August 14th, 2016, I built the terrarium within this latch top jar. A terrarium is only as good as its foundational level, in this case a false bottom layer of gravel topped with a window screen barrier. A proper substrate is also imperative. This blend was comprised of cocoa fiber, sphagnum moss, orchid bark, sand, and carbon. I placed this on top of the false bottom and the foundation was set. Back then, plant terrariums were very typical, but I wanted to change it up by adding hardscape. I arranged the pieces to assemble a mountain range of sorts where I could nestle the plants. The old 125-gallon vivarium was set up at the time, so I simply pulled a few items from there. Anubias rhizomes between the wood set the tone. Envisioning dense foliage, I planted oakleaf creeping fig and java moss to blanket the wood and carpet the ground. Tufts of reindeer moss followed by gravel provided texture and variation. Springtails are the secret to success. Adding them transforms a terrarium into a thriving ecosystem. And of course, life revolves around water, making it a crucial component. Once sealed in the jar, it would sustain this mini world and its inhabitants for the foreseeable future. It began taking on a life of its own immediately. Just a month later, and the growth of everything was astounding. Each cutting of oakleaf creeping fig grew at least an inch longer, while the moss expanded to new frontiers. These plants grew as intended, beginning to envelop the landscape, but the wood itself was coming to life in a different way. Tiny mushrooms and fungi sprung up, creating an enchanting display and a feast for the springtails. 2 months later, things continued on this trajectory. The moss was filling in nicely. Despite a few yellowing leaves, the Anubias had new growth as well. However, the creeping fig was getting out of hand, so I decided it was time for maintenance. This was prior to patenting the sniff test, so I simply got to work. I made adjustments to encourage the plants to grow up the wood. Other sections I trimmed and placed elsewhere. Although unnecessary, I target watered the moss to promote growth. The springtails didn't appreciate this though. After cleaning the glass and closing the lid, it sat untouched for 3 more months. As the space filled with life, changes began happening more gradually than before. Even so, the Anubias sent off a new runner plant, and the moss fortified its position on the land. It, alongside the fungi from before, continued on their conquest to engulf the driftwood. Meanwhile, they were unaware of their adversary growing beneath, the creeping fig. It halted its visual progress to focus on establishing a vast root system. Seemingly absent from the whole thing, the springtails primarily found refuge in the false bottom. The fig's tactic of strengthening its roots paid off. 1 year in, and the vines engulfed the entire terrarium, rendering it unrecognizable. In fact, it grew so significantly that some of the lower vines were dying off. However, the moss was still asserting its dominance. It was creeping up the glass, defeated the fungus at the Battle of the Driftwood, and did something unexpected. The dried sphagnum moss that I mixed within the substrate resurrected and mingled with the others. All the while, the Anubias increased in size, sending its own set of roots down through the layers beneath. This must have prompted the springtails to resume residency in the lands above. For me, terrariums are an art form. In other words, aesthetics matter. So I opened it for maintenance once again. And it was by this point that no checkup would be complete without the smell test. The scent of the forest permeated from this mini ecosystem, confirming its health. Scissors in hand, I mowed through the fig and exposed the life hidden within. Grime on the glass obstructed the view and restricted light from getting to the plants. This all greatly refined the appearance. I added a few drops of water to account for any loss during maintenance and sealed it for another year. Back at it again with another sniff to kick things off, and it smelled great. The fig may have been victorious last time, but the moss returned with a vengeance, except for that spot on the wood. That dried up. With 2 different species growing amok, they were unstoppable. That was until I decided to do maintenance and mowed the lawn. I also thinned the fig to remove unsightly areas and encourage new growth. Having clean glass would help with that as well. Upon closer inspection, I discovered more fungus, which is yet another indicator of an established, thriving ecosystem. Putting some of the trimmings and dead leaves back into the system helps replenish nutrients as they decompose. So I made sure to do that, added water to compensate for loss, and springtails to bolster the population. After sealing it up, I let it sit and returned at the 3-year milestone. Other than growing in, things didn't change much. That said, the Anubias grew and continued to expand its roots. The springtail population peaked as well, and there was a ton cruising throughout the setup. By now, you know the drill. I opened it, gave it the sniff, examined the interior, trimmed things, added water, and cleaned the glass. However, there was a significant issue I recognized. The gasket was entirely dry rotten, so I replaced it and sealed the jar. It looked great thereafter and would continue to do well into the following year. It was just overgrown. After opening and sniffing it, I moved things around to get a better look. As I did, I noticed that the Anubias yellowed significantly. I suspected that it was from lack of light. I proceeded to remove these sections, chop them up, and return them to the substrate as before. I wiped down the glass, topped it off, and sealed it up till last year. 6 years in, and the biggest change was me. It's funny because looking back through the footage, I can see how I've evolved alongside this terrarium. It's pretty cool. Hopefully I still pass the sniff test, because you know for sure the terrarium did. All jokes aside, the terrarium was thriving and overgrown. However, many of the Anubias leaves were dead, so I removed them. All of the moss was noticeably thinner as well. Looking back, I'd say it was a gradual process from being placed in a brighter location. That didn't affect how I manicured it though. You'll notice that I'm trimming, removing, and replanting throughout these maintenance sessions to get a proper look. In most cases, all of the materials return to the system, just in a different configuration. Wiping off the glass is my minimum recommendation to ensure the plants have adequate access to light. I always add water before sealing it up too. Now this is how it looked a year ago, and I haven't done anything with it since. It's been resting on the fireplace mantle upstairs. Honestly, I haven't even had time to look at it since we moved. This probably isn't an ideal location because of the intense lighting, so I don't know what to expect. Before we take a closer look though, I'll circle back to the questions from the beginning. What does it take to maintain something like this? Even though I prefer to do maintenance as illustrated thus far, you don't have to do anything if the container is sealed. However, the aesthetic may suffer. Do they actually work long term? This one was 6 years old when you last saw it, so I'd say that's a yes. And what is the state of this terrarium today? Well, let's find out together. Visibility into the jar isn't great. Previously it was overgrown, but now the glass is covered in moss, spores, and algae. Clearly the moss itself is doing well, but it will be impossible to get an accurate assessment without opening the jar. Ah, now that's a familiar smell. It was light and airy with a robust earthy undertone. Some might say reminiscent of a walk in the woods with notes of petrichor. It smelled good. Inside I noticed little balls peppered throughout the grime. I'm unsure, but I suspect that they are wood mite or springtail carcasses. Either way, I just want to clear the glass of all the debris. This was by far the dirtiest I've seen it, and it's always so satisfying to get a better point of view. I trimmed the moss and packed it down for denser growth. I also discovered that the years haven't been kind to the wood. The fungus and humidity have taken their toll, rendering it brittle. I realized I never followed up on the reindeer moss either. Over the years, it simply dissolved. Although I adjusted the ficus, this will be the first time in 7 years that I won't trim it. It's sparser than in the past and needs to regain vitality. The Anubias is still doing its thing too, but these aren't the original plants. They're the runners that grew off from them. After adding a few drops of water and closing the lid, I stepped back to take it all in. Historically, it was more grown in, and even though it doesn't appear that way now, I believe it's still thriving. Keeping it in a less than ideal condition likely took a toll on its progress. That's alright though, life ebbs and flows. What can we expect moving forward? The plants will continue growing and competing with each other. Things will live, things will die, and it will constantly be in a state of flux. In other words, life will go on as it always has.